welcome back to my channel. First of all, I just want to thank everyone that showed their support on the first video. It done way better than I thought it was ever going to do. So today's video is literally going to be a walkthrough on all the things I think are necessary for you to start sewing. It's going to be aimed at people that are wanting to start sewing, but again, if you just want to collect some extra knowledge, then this is for you too. If you've got a machine for Christmas or you bought it over lockdown to give yourself something to do, then I'm going to show you all the things you need to know to actually start a sewing project. I'm going to go over all the basic functions of your sewing machine, all the little bits in the machine that you don't know what they do. I'm going to explain what they mean. I know for a fact that when I started sewing with a domestic machine when I was a lot younger, I didn't know what a lot of things were. I just sewed, got off the machine and hope for the best. I will walk you through on my machine, which is the Brother machine. It will be different looking on every single machine, but hopefully if I explain the functions well enough, you'll be able to identify what dials on your machine do the same as the ones on mine that I'm about to point out. I'll then go over all the tools that I think are handy to have if you're going to start sewing projects, just to make it a lot easier for yourselves. And I will link in the description all the ones that I have used. I've got my exact ones linked, and I'll also link in alternative ones from like Amazon, Dunelm, like shops like that. Since we're in lockdown right now, I know it's not easy just to pop to the shops and pick stuff up. I'm then going to show you how just to sew a basic seam. A 1.5cm seam is pretty basic in most beginner sewing projects. There is different rules for different parts of the body, but for starting out, all you need to know is 1.5cm for a seam of 2 bits of fabric you're joining together is ideal. With that said, let's get into the video. So here's my machine. It is the Brother H27 Strong and Tough, made specifically for denim and leather. This first dial here is your stitch length. This controls how tight your stitch is, and the smaller it is, the tighter it will be. I tend to keep my stitch length at about 2.5 or even 2, as this is secure enough but still big enough that if you make a mistake it is easy to unpick. This next dial is your stitch width. This is usually depicted with a straight line going into a zigzag line. This controls where your needle sits, therefore you want this to be in the centre of the scale when sewing a straight line of stitching, or else your seam allowance might not be accurate. My centre of my machine is number 4, and it's actually notched on the dial, so hopefully yours is too, because it makes it a lot easier when you're sewing in a straight line. This last dial is your tension. This affects your tension on your thread when you're sewing. I usually have this set to halfway and I don't touch it very often. So here's a little close up of your dials, your stitch length, your stitch width and your tension. This lever here is your back tack. Hold it down for a second when you're almost at the end of the line you're sewing, and this sews back over your stitch and secures it. So here are your stitch types. As you can see, I'm set to number 2, which is your standard straight stitch. I only really use 1, 2 or 3, but starting out you will only really need number 2. So over here, this actually controls your needle, helps you when you're placing it to sew. The dial below this for me controls my stitch type. This might be different in your machine. You might have buttons, but hopefully you're able to figure it out on your own machine. So we've got a little close-up of your needle and your measurement plate now. So below here we have your centimetres, and above is inches. This might be different on your machine. However, I'll stick with centimetres. 1.5 is the standard, as I mentioned before. So hopefully yours is similar to mine, and if not, you understand what it shows. So this little button at the back here, this actually releases your foot if you're ever needing to change it over for a zipper foot or anything, but for beginner tasks you might not need to do this. Up here we have our little lever to release the foot and bring it back up again when need be. And just a little tip as well, on the side here you actually have a little thread cutter. Every machine I've had has had this, but I'm not sure if it's standard. So next up we're going to thread up your bottom threads. Take your spool out of its place. This is just a standard domestic sewing machine spool. You'll probably get spare ones with your machine too. These are, however, very easy to lose, so I would suggest keeping them in a little box, just in case you need them. Place them up top. You want to push this over to the right hand side. This cuts this little mechanism off from the foot and just onto the motor itself. So this will stop the needle from going up and down when you are filling up your spool. So I'm placing on my fuchsia thread to the top part. Once it's secure, we are then ready to thread up. So this little hook is the first thing. So it goes back the way, and then we're going to go loop it round this bit at the back. You will have a diagram at the top of your machine. As you can probably see, I have one on mine. So you hook it around there, and then the most important part is through that tension disc. making sure, giving it a little tug to make sure it's secure, and then wrapping it around your spool clockwise just to secure it in place. A close up showing the diagram on the top, and here we have our little spool filling up with our pink thread. So after our little spool is full, we have to click it back to the left hand side to release it and just snip it off of the bobbin of thread with our little thread scissors. Now that it's full, we can pop our spool back inside of the sewing machine. So like the little picture shows, the thread needs to be going anti-clockwise. Bring it round, hook it round this little hook here, and then that should be it secured in place. Next up, we're going to thread up our top thread. So very similar to filling up the bottom spool, you want to hook it around there, bring it round the back at the loop, but instead of going round the tension disc, we are following the straight line all the way down, like that, as the diagram shows at the bottom. Loop it round, back up on itself. Then inside this little channel, there is a little metal arm that this hooks round in the inside. You can kind of see it peeking out there. So hook them round there and then down to the bottom. You then want to thread it through the needle, plain and simple. Hopefully you can do better than I was here. And then just hook that on the little clip just above. This just keeps the thread out of the way when you are sewing, and it makes it so much easier, as does tucking the thread underneath the foot when you are fully threaded up. So taking hold of just the top thread, putting a little bit of tension on it, you're wanting to wind the mechanism that controls the needle down into that bit there, so it feeds itself round the spool case at the bottom and brings up our bottom thread. So once you pull this bottom thread all the way through, and again for neatness just tuck it under the foot, you have both your threads coming through the mechanism. Put your little case back on, and then you are ready to start sewing. Well, you obviously need fabric to start a sewing project. I've picked just a plain white cotton so you can see my contrasting pink stitch on the fabric. So these are my fabric scissors. They're super sharp, great for cutting fabric. If you're a beginner, you might not have these. Simple kitchen scissors, like these ones, will also work when cutting fabric. These are my thread scissors. They are super light, really sharp, and really small, handy just to have sitting about to cut threads when you're sewing. So for marking fabric, chalk would work, but on white I tend to go for a mechanical pencil. And this is my Pincushion. He holds all my pins so they don't end up on my carpet. So this might be kind of confusing, but I am going to try and explain it as easy as possible. So your fabric has two ways. It's got the warp and the weft. So stretching it that way, it's tight. Stretching it that way, it's tight. Obviously cotton is not a stretch fabric. However, on the bias, any fabric will stretch going against its grain. So what you want to do is make sure what you're cutting out is on the grain line. So opening up the fabric, I'm going to cut out two squares. Obviously my fabric's doubled over, so cutting out a square, making sure it's perpendicular to the grain lines. Don't get too caught up on this. This only really makes a difference if you're making garments. If you don't cut to the grain lines, things can get a little bit twisted and don't sit properly. Here are my two pieces of fabric I cut out. I'm going to go ahead and mark them with an X just to let myself know which is the wrong side and the right side. This doesn't really matter for this fabric because both sides are the same, but some fabric have a wrong side and a right side. So marking the wrong side with the X. So I'm going to place the X down facing the table and then do the other one facing up the way. This will mean the right sides are facing together so that when I pin them together it will be correct. Now we have to pin our fabric together. Some people do pin it at an angle like this and take them out as they're sewing. Some people go straight across and again take them out as they're sewing, but I do tend to go up and down. Up and down with your pins. You don't actually have to take them out when you're sewing your straight stitch across. Your needle just glides over the pins. So here I'm just showing you how many I would put in this bit of fabric, how far apart. It's usually about 1.5 inches. You don't want to put too many pins, just enough so you can hold it to secure your fabric whilst you're sewing that straight stitch all the way across. So now we're going to sew our seam allowance. So placing the fabric down, put the foot down, making sure that it measures up to that 1.5 line on your measurement plate. You want to move your thread out of the way so it doesn't get caught, and sort of lower your needle into the fabric like that. Line it all up and then start to stitch. Remember that back tack at the start just to secure your stitch, and then continue the stitch all the way down, making sure the seam lines up with the 1.5 all the way, keeping it consistent. And then coming back to the end of the stitch line, you want to back tack again just to secure it, and that is you finished. You want to pull it off to the side, and this time I couldn't actually find my scissors, so I used a little blade at the side of the machine just to cut the thread off at the very end like that. So once we remove the pins, we have our seam allowance. We actually want to open this up and press it flat. This just helps to make the piece neat and tidy. It helps it sit better if you're making a garment. This could be the side seam. It just helps it sit flat against the body instead of sitting bulky. And here we go, we have a perfectly pressed seam. If you have any questions to do with any sewing, tips how to get started, comment below or DM me on Instagram, and I'll happily answer you and give you advice on anything I can. Thanks a lot guys, and see you next video.